Hey, good morning. Welcome back. It's great to have you back for Module 3 of the Community Addiction Recovery Education Training Series. We're super excited that you're taking the time out to better educate yourself around addiction and recovery to improve outcomes. So let's go ahead and get started on this module. This module today is on return to use. We're going to take a deep dive into helping you better understand why do people return to use despite the negative consequences? They know that drug using causes problems, and yet they continue to use. Well, then it must be a moral choice, right? It must be a moral failing. They want to use, they choose to use. I hope I can demystify that for you today. So let's go ahead and get started on this journey. Defining return to use, formerly known as relapse and slip. So we know the term relapse in our world today to mean when somebody has returned to drug use. And what we also know is that there's been a lot of research on stigmatizing language. And we now know that relapse is proven, has been researched to be a stigmatizing term that can prevent people from asking for help or trying to achieve drug use goals, or trying to pick themselves back up after a return to use. So let's look at some of the new language, and hopefully you'll be willing to adopt this new language into your culture. So return to use, formerly called relapse, is a full return to previous patterns of use. And what that means is if an individual was formerly a heroin user and they discontinued heroin, and maybe they're using marijuana at the time as their moderation-based recovery program, then they return to a full-blown pattern of behavior with their heroin. That's called a return to use. And what we want to be looking at here, and I introduced this concept in Module 1, is patterns of behavior. We all have patterns of behavior. Drug use patterns of behavior lead to negative consequences. So when somebody has returned to their full previous patterns of behavior, that's called return to use. Super, 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 folks, important to understand that when somebody does return to use, it does not mean that they've given up. It does not mean that they are hopeless. It does not mean that they have abandoned their drug use goals. It just means there was a roadblock and there's room for improvement. When Module 2, I talked about behaviors, I talked about replacing old patterns of behaviors with new patterns of behaviors. And it's a lifestyle change. And an individual may not recognize that a pattern of behavior is associated with their drug use. And when it occurs and reoccurs, that pattern of behavior, the brain sends a message that says, I'm familiar with this pattern of behavior and I'm used to using with it. So please go get me my drugs that make me feel comfortable and safe and protected. That does not mean that somebody doesn't want to stop using. It's a setback, it's a roadblock. We're going to learn how to move beyond that. And then there's a slip, reoccurrence, or a lapse. A slip can also be known as a lapse, and is a situation where someone has a very brief slip where they drink or use, but they stop quickly afterward. I know for me, it took me 18 months until I was finally able to put the drink down for the very last time on October 18th, 2010. During those 18 months, I had many periods of sobriety and abstinence. I would go 30 days at a time, 60 days at a time, and then I would return to use for a couple of days, maybe one day, sometimes 1 week. And then I'd be right back in my program again. And society said to me, you're a failure. Trust me when I tell you, the court system, my ex-husband, my family told me that I was a failure and I was never going to recover. And beating somebody down like that when they have a slip or a reoccurrence is not helpful. It is really part of the journey. For most people, not always, but for most people, learning these behaviors associated with drug use is an opportunity to replace that pattern of behavior with something healthier, to help remap out the brain. Relapse, reoccurrence, slips is part of the journey for most people. Slip, reoccurrence, or lapse is an instance of substance use by someone who has set drug use goals. In order to have a slip or a reoccurrence or a lapse, you got to have a drug use goals. Otherwise, you don't have a setback. I hope that makes sense. And a slip does not necessarily mean that someone is going to return to their full patterns of behavior with their former use. It can be, and oftentimes it is, a learning opportunity and a temporary situation. It does not mean that someone does not want to achieve recovery by any means. It's a message. Myth, let's talk about this myth. When someone returns to use or has a reoccurrence, their drug use goals have been abandoned. They've given up, they're never going to change, they're hopeless. This is not true, folks. We need to squash this myth and start changing the narrative around this and start having a paradigm shift in our own messaging. The fact is, a slip or return to use can fuel their decision to get back on track and stay. It can provide necessary, vital information for someone to get on track and stay on track. It acts as fuel and motivation to continue forward with better progress. Not every wave is a tsunami. Not every slip leads to full-blown return to use. And oftentimes in our world, the way it is today with a lot of the messaging is that's the way we treat these return to uses or these reoccurrences. It's important to embrace that not every wave is a tsunami and that not every slip is a full-blown return to use, because it will ultimately affect the way that you treat those with substance use disorder. If you're in law enforcement, if you're a first responder, if you're a family court worker or a clinician or a prescriber, you must understand this about addiction and recovery, that you have biases. And for those of us in addiction and recovery, we can sense what you're thinking. We've felt it all before, we've heard it all before, and the way that you treat us matters. And if you can embrace the idea that a lapse or a slip is a part of the recovery journey for steps forward, imagine what that language would look like to the receiver. Instead of, you're a failure, you might say, you know what? Let's figure out what happened and let's keep moving forward. Imagine what that would feel like. This understanding can release an individual. I'm speaking about family, loved ones, court systems, probation officers, prescribers, anyone who works with individuals with substance use disorder. It can help release that individual from the fear and terror often experienced by loved ones, right? We've seen it, we feel it, we experience it when you hear about a loved one who has returned to a pattern of behavior or maybe had a slip. It's painful, it's distressing, it's disheartening, and there's always a loss felt. There's pain. But let's think about this in a different light and have hope that it is a stepping stone, especially if handled right. It can help release an individual from the high expectation that abstinence is linear. Folks, abstinence is not linear. For some people it is, and those folks are blessed. Maybe they have more willingness, maybe they have more resources. Who knows the reason why for some it's linear, but for most it is not a start to finish line. This can help relieve individuals from the urge to take drastic actions when they may not have been necessary. The better approach is to have a conversation with people and start to redirect, realign. What can we do different this time? What can you do different this time? What did you learn from this experience? This view can change the landscape of those affected with substance use disorder who feel like more of a failure as a result of not being able to stop. Looking at reoccurrence from this lens promotes the 3 E's, critical to help supporting somebody to achieve sustainable recovery: empathy, encouragement, and empowerment. Let's make connections instead of disconnections. It's not easy. I'm not here to tell you it is easy. And whatever role you have with someone with substance use disorder who might be actively using, clear boundaries are a must. Your engagement with the individual directly impacts the outcome to success. Systems dictate that an individual with substance use disorder, through current treatment models, ought to be able to go from chaotic drug use to abstinence without moving through any of these other phases. Now, when folks stop smoking, sometimes they go through a program where they decrease their cigarettes per day or per week. Some folks with diets, when they embark on this journey, might start out by decreasing their calorie intake or certain foods over a period of time. And it's a progression. And it's important to understand that drug use is the same way. Addiction and substance use disorder are the same process. When we started out using drugs or alcohol, we didn't start out in chaotic use for most of us. We all were born, most of us, some have fetal alcohol syndrome or some other perinatal syndrome. And I'm not specifically referring to those cases. But many of us start out in abstinence, right? We're born, we're abstinence. And somewhere in our journey of life, we start to experiment, whether it's a drink when we're 16 or smoking a joint at 18. And then maybe it switches to occasional and social, and then to moderation. It starts to become more regular, and then it can go into heavy use, and then to chaotic drug use. This is the timeline for someone to move from occasional and social to substance use disorder. And for us to think that an individual is going to go in reverse on the dial from chaotic to abstinence is quite a stretch. Like any other behavior change, things are done in moderation. Have you ever heard the word moderation? Everything in moderation, right? Well, let's try to change our thinking about the way we invite folks to enter into a recovery program. I'm not saying it's going to work for everybody, and I'm not saying this is the rule. It's a consideration when working with individuals. Most choices are driven by immediate results. In our society, it's I want what I want when I want it, right? I want it now. I want it yesterday, faster, better, bigger. That's our culture. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's the world we live in today. Well, we have societal pressure for that person who's experiencing substance use disorder to go from a hopeless lifestyle with chaotic drug use and unrealistic expectations where after treatment, they should be physically active and feeling spiritually connected and having meaningful activity and all the dimensions of the wellness wheel. We have this unwritten expectation, this narrative that says a person should go from this spot to this spot in 28 days of treatment. That is unrealistic. Oftentimes it doesn't work. And when we have this narrative, when we have this expectation and it doesn't pan out that way, we're setting the individual up for failure and we're setting ourselves up for disappointment. A look at more realistic expectations. A better proven way to address reduced drug use is to find out where people are at. Now, listen, I know you've probably heard and you probably said, I'm going to meet them where they're at. I'm going to meet them where they're at. But I can tell you folks that you don't know where somebody's at after one meeting, after two meetings, after 5 meetings, or even living with them for a year. Because oftentimes a person experiencing substance use disorder doesn't even know where they're at. They don't even know how they got into active substance use disorder. And for the individual, it's a journey of experiencing, how did I get here, before or while taking the journey to improved health and well-being. And so I want to offer you a mantra. Instead of saying meet them where they're at, we meet people where they're at when they're in houseless, unhoused shelters, or they're on the streets, or maybe they're in low socioeconomic communities. That's outreach. That's when we meet people where they're at. In order to help somebody with substance use disorder, we have to help find out where they're at. And assuming that we're going to know this in a day or two is an unrealistic expectation. So whether changing use or changing conditions around use, harm reduction is a social justice movement, and it aims for client-centered improvements. And it reduces the stress associated with abstinence. Hey there, this is Ginger. I hope you're learning a lot from this series. I'm asking for your help in supporting my tireless efforts. There's a few ways in which you can support me. Tell your friends about this video series, subscribe and like each video here on YouTube down below, make a donation on my website, or invite me to deliver this training in person. Together, we can all be part of the solution. Hope to see you soon, and thank you.